Good evening. Welcome to the City Talks and the Lansdowne Lecture Series in the History Department. Before I introduce Professor Michael Katz, I want to make an announcement, remind those of you who are here for the City Talks that we have another City Talk on November 22nd. Joy Kagawa is going to talk about forthcoming work that she's doing on the Second World War, part of our ongoing series recognizing the 70th anniversary of the uprooting of the Japanese population from coastal BC. I also have an announcement for those of you who might return. The gallery requests that we not bring coffees to the talks. And on our part for the series, we'll try to make them interesting enough that you won't need to have coffee during the talks. I'm Jordan Stanger-Ross in the History Department and also connected with the City Talks and the Committee for Urban Studies at the University of Victoria. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Katz. Michael Katz is the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. And I first met Michael by misleading him somewhat. I was a first-year graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, and it was clear that Michael was someone worth getting to know. And early in that year, he posted an ad for a graduate student to help build a website for an undergraduate class that he was running, where students had to put statistics onto a website. Now, I had no idea how to build a website. I had no experience, no capacity in website construction, no knowledge in this area whatsoever, so I answered his ad. In the interview, Michael asked nothing about website construction or computer languages or such. We had a lovely conversation, after which he hired me. I left that meeting and promptly hired someone else, subcontracted someone else to assist me in constructing a website for Michael's class, and I had achieved what would be probably my most productive deception of my life. I couldn't have found a better place in academia. Dr. Katz is for me, and I think for all of his advisees, and he has many in many different places in Canada and the United States. I think he's for me and for all of us a model. As a scholar, Dr. Katz uniquely blends, at least in my view, theoretical precision, methodological and empirical rigor, and political and social passion. He's brought these sensibilities to several areas of American history, and even to some contributions to Canadian history as well, making major contributions in several areas. After receiving a PhD in education at Harvard, Michael began his career here in Canada, first taking posts at Boise and the University of Toronto, and then subsequently at York University. During this time, he made landmark contributions to the history of education, and then to the history of cities and social class in North America. He was a pioneer of quantitative methods, using the census and other similar sources to tell the stories of everyday people, families, and neighborhoods that had previously been left out of predominant historical accounts. Although not all historians have adopted quantitative methods in the years that followed, these efforts did help to transform the constituents of history. Generations of historians since that new social history have embraced the notion that we must tell the stories of everyday and in some sense unimportant people. In the late 1970s, Michael relocated to the University of Pennsylvania and shifted into another area of scholarship. In 5 major books, Michael explored the 20th century American welfare state, alerting scholars to the tremendous achievements and ongoing potential of the welfare state, as well as to its limits and its blunders. Why Don't American Cities Burn? This book, which is for sale here, the University Library bookstore is here selling copies of the book, should you wish, is Michael's 12th major monograph. It's been described as brilliantly conceived and beautifully written, It's my pleasure to invite him to come to the stage and speak to you about this work. He's a person worth lying to get to know.
Thank you, Jordan, for that great introduction. Well, I didn't know that story. That's really cool. So you see how ingenious Jordan is and has been. Well, it's a real pleasure to be back here in Victoria. I try to remember, I think I don't think I've been here since sometime in the early or mid-80s. And it's so beautiful. I'm flying in today from, I was supposed to come in yesterday, and I would have flown directly from, changed planes in Toronto, flown directly in at night, and because of the bad weather I had to come in today, so then I had to fly from Vancouver, and with the sky so clear and all, it was just a gorgeous flight in. And it's really, you know, so it's great to be here, and also, you know, to have the different generations of my students represented here. Jordan, of course, a fairly recent student from Philadelphia, my years at Penn, and Alison Prentice, who is here, one of my greatest students, and one of the very first from the OSU U of T days. Makes it a very special evening. So what I'm going to do this evening is to give a kind of an overview of some of the main themes in this new book, Why Don't American Cities Burn? So why don't American cities, and also this is I have a new iPad, and this is the first, I also have a paper, I have it here, and I have the paper version in case it doesn't work. But you know, I thought it would be neat to be able to lecture from the iPad, and from, you know, so I got it. The justification of this toy is that I'm going to use it for my lecture class next semester. So I'm going to try it out and see how this works. But as I say, if it breaks down, I do have paper. So why don't American cities burn? It takes its title from a chapter in the book provoked by the 2005 riots in French cities. Why, I asked, had collective violence more or less disappeared from the streets of American cities? Alienation, marginalization, youth unemployment, distrust of the police, these surely were as prevalent in them as in cities in France. In fact, social pathologies believed to have sparked major civil violence in American cities during the 1960s and the early 1970s. Poverty, racial segregation, unemployment had, if anything, grown worse. Yet with a couple of exceptions, collective violence had not erupted on city streets. Instead, violence had turned inward, manifest in drive-by shootings, gangs, and shocking homicide rates among young men. How and why had this happened? Why Don't American Cities Burn is, however, about more than the question of urban violence. In the larger sense, it's about the collision between urban transformation and rightward moving social politics. A series of economic, demographic, and spatial changes have transformed American cities, producing an urban form unlike any other in history. At the same time, American politics has been moving right. Federal and state governments have been cutting the safety net, reducing aid to cities, attacking trade unions, allowing the value of the minimum wage to erode, and whenever possible, applying market-based solutions to public business. The coexistence of these trends produces a collision with ordinary people caught in the middle. And the evidence is all around us, at least in American cities, in rising rates of poverty and homelessness, declining real wages, decayed inner cities, failing public services, home mortgage foreclosures, high unemployment, and mass incarceration. The book's prologue looks at the result of this collision on the ground. It tells a story of murder and marginalization in the Badlands of Philadelphia, a place where an explosive collision between urban transformation and rightward moving social politics has trapped residents in a devastated urban landscape with few sources of help. Two men, Herbert and Shorty, found themselves locked in a mortal struggle over $5. And in the end, one, Shorty, died. In 2005, 375 homicides occurred in Philadelphia, most in poor, heavily African-American neighborhoods. Of the victims, 339 were men and 308 were black. Many of the killings resulted from arguments, and most of the victims died of gunshot wounds, not by stabbing as with Shorty. Most were younger than Shorty, who was 41. On the week of Shorty's death, 11 homicides took place in the city. Only 4 of these made either of the major newspapers, and of these, 3 were odd cases. A white girl shot in a drive-by shooting, a promising young man about to start college gunned down, a white man shot by a friend while sleeping on a sofa. Only in the use of a knife rather than the gun was Shorty's death exceptional. I was a juror on the murder trial that resulted from Shorty's death. The book's prologue, The Death of Shorty, which tells the story of the trial and its aftermath for me, provides a concrete, vivid illustration of all the book's themes. It shows how complicated and interconnected the issues are, and it reminds readers that the historical and sociological material in the book refers to real people, human beings struggling to survive with some dignity on the mean streets of North Philadelphia and other American cities. For decades, I've tried to write about poverty, its context, and the ideas and policies used to explain or ameliorate it. I also have written, read, and thought a great deal about cities, especially the transformations which have produced the North Philadelphias of America. But even here, I fall into stereotypes. North Philadelphia is a complex and varied place that belies its reputation for blight and social disorganization. But there is an abstraction to most of the literature, including what I have written. Even in reading the best ethnographies, a layer of experience separates me from the day-to-day reality of lives spent on the kind of streets where Shorty lived. This is so even though I've lived for more than 30 years in West Philadelphia, where diversity is the only thread uniting the individuals who pass by our house every day. I've tried to enter the lives of extremely poor people in the past, reconstructing the histories of the poorest New Yorkers in the early 20th century from charity records and complementary sources. By piecing these life stories together, I unravel the complexity and the strength, as well as the pathos and sometimes disorganization in the lives of desperately poor women. But before writing about this trial, I'd never done the same for their counterparts today. Herbert's trial encapsulated what I had been struggling to understand and write about, converging on the histories of Herbert and Shorty, although I was missing many details, were deindustrialization, white flight, racial segregation, and concentrated poverty, the failures of urban education, a job market that excluded an extraordinary share of black men, the ravages of drugs, the importance of the informal economy, and a criminal justice system that in practice values the lives of black men less than mine or those of my friends. The rest of Why Don't American Cities Burn opens up some of the themes condensed into this one story of murder and marginalization in an old American city. It's a story that cannot be interpreted apart from the transformation of cities in the late 20th century and the emergence of urban forms unlike any others in history. Nor can it be understood apart from the trajectory of African American social structure, which opened up class and gender divisions among blacks, leaving men like Herbert and Shorty outside the regular labor market, relegated to semi-illicit work and the charity of the state or prison, while others, like Barack Obama, ascended and still is there, thankfully, to heights unimaginable only a few decades earlier. It provokes an uncomfortable confrontation with questions of authority and legitimation. Why is it that black men who are unable to leave bleak inner-city neighborhoods have turned their rage inward on one another, and not as they did 40 or 50 years ago on the agents and symbols of a politics, culture, and economy that exclude them from first-class citizenship? For centuries, American discourse about poverty has divided poor people into categories based on their assumed moral worth. Herbert and Shorty belong to the long line of the undeserving poor. They epitomize the urban underclass that terrified Americans in the 1980s and 1990s. By the early 21st century, however, cutting-edge technologies of poverty were jettisoning pathological constructions of poor people, as new poverty warriors tossed the underclass on the trash heap of intellectual history. Where were Herbert and Shorty left standing? Did they join the new world of the entrepreneurial poor, or did they find themselves in a no man's land for all practical purposes and except for prison, abandoned by the state and philanthropy, but not invited to shop in the new store stocked with market-based plans for reducing poverty? In the end, Herbert and Shorty found themselves caught in the collision between urban transformation and rightward-moving social politics. It is this collision that underlay my attempt to expand the story of Herbert and Shorty's fatal encounter in the Badlands of North Philly. The first side of this story, urban transformation, is the subject of the first substantive chapter, which asks, what is an American city? It shows how economic, demographic, and spatial changes resulted in unique urban forms. It uses the idea of a new domestic landscape to illustrate dramatic change in the spatial ecology of suburbs. And it points to the variety of new metaphors deployed with only partial success to capture new meanings of urban, city, and suburb. For many years I argued that in the decades after World War II, economic, demographic, and spatial transformations in the United States resulted in an urban form unlike any other in history. A few years ago, I realized that in one important way, this formulation misleads. It misleads because it reports the outcome of history as singular when it should be plural. That is, form should be forms, an unprecedented configuration of urban places that called into question the definition of city itself. One configuration is represented by the deindustrialized landscape of destitution that is a short ride up Broad Street from the newly revitalized core of Center City, Philadelphia, but there are many others as well. The April 25th, 2006 death of Jane Jacobs was one of the events that prompted me to rethink the assumptions underlying my narrative of recent urban history. If any one person can be appointed patron saint of urban studies, Jane Jacobs deserves the crown. Her 1961 Death and Life of Great American Cities certainly must be the most widely read and influential book ever written about American cities. After half a century, it still retains its powerful impact. I've often assigned it to students who invariably find it moving and convincing. Death and Life resonates with their ideal of urbanism and gives them a set of criteria for identifying a good city. With the book as a yardstick, they find that today's cities come up short. Although the book has the same effect on me, new delights every time I reread it, I began to wonder if it does as much to inhibit as to advance our grasp of American cities today. Its identification of mixed use, short blocks, multi-age dwellings, and density as the crucial collection of features that define a healthy neighborhood, finds its model in old cities such as Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and many of the cities of Europe. At least implicitly, this makes the goal of urban reform recapturing the past. Yet the growing, dynamic, vibrant components of urban America are at least as much like Phoenix and Los Angeles as the old East Coast cities. With Jacobs' criteria, they never can qualify as good cities. Mutant forms of urbanism, they repel rather than attract anyone who loves cities. But is this a useful assessment? Is the fault with these cities or with the criteria? Did Jacobs bequeath us a core set of ideas that define urbanism, or do we need a different set of markers to characterize what makes a city, and a good city, in early 21st century America? Certainly the former, the belief in a core set of ideas defining healthy urbanism, underlies one of the most influential urban design movements today, New Urbanism. New Urbanism does not take Jacobs' criteria literally, although her spirit clearly marches through its emphasis on density, mixed-use residential, commercial use, pedestrian-friendly streets, and vibrant public spaces. Its charter defines a core set of principles it considers adaptable to a wide variety of places, from suburbs to shopping malls. The other view, which finds New Urbanism an exercise in nostalgia that's out of touch with the forces driving urban change, is represented by Robert Brugman in his 2000 book, Sprawl, A Compact History, where he approvingly cites architectural writer Alex Krieger, who he says argues, quote, persuasively that the new urbanism is only the latest version of a long-standing desire by cultural elites to manage middle-class urban life. Even more than Jacobs' death, what forced me to confront the protein quality of today's urbanism and the inadequacy of singular definitions grew out of research and writing a book on the 20th century, One Nation Divisible, What America Was and What It Is Becoming, with Mark Stern. Stern and I set out to examine how the 2000 U.S. Census reflected social and economic trends during the 20th century. We concluded that America is living through a transformation as profound as the Industrial Revolution, one that reshapes everything, from family to class, from race and gender to cities. Events on the ground, the trends we identified and discussed, have undermined the concepts with which we interpret public life: work, city, race, family, nationality. All of them have lost their moorings in the way life is actually lived today. Their conventional meanings lie smashed, badly in need of redefinition. The same situation occurred during the transformation to the 20th century, when an emergent industrial civilization, also based on a global economy, shattered existing ideas, producing, among other changes, a new form, the industrial city. Early 20th century urban reformers, struggling to define and tame industrial cities, grappled with the consequences of massive immigration by people with different cultures, the lack of affordable housing, the growth of poverty and homelessness, crises in public health and sanitation, and the impact of growing concentrations of wealth on society and politics. They worried about the role of privatization in municipal services, the heavy hand of state government, the weakness of mayoral executive authority, the corruption of machine politics, the inefficiencies and inequities of the courts, and the regressive and inadequate foundation of city finances on property taxes. In the late 19th and early 20th century, cities tried to respond to these issues with active government, what historians have labeled progressivism. Despite the persistence of corruption, widespread poverty, and racial discrimination in these decades, cities increased municipal expenditures, professionalized their administrations, and constructed buildings and infrastructures that supported the most vibrant, successful era in American urban life. In the late 20th century, by contrast, the response was the withdrawal of active government, evidenced in reduced federal funds, reliance on market-based solutions to urban problems, and the need to turn to private initiatives like special services districts to carry out public functions such as street cleaning and security. The results are everywhere to be seen in hopelessness on city streets, poverty spreading outwards to inner suburbs, uncontrolled sprawl, eating up open space, crumbling infrastructure, gross inequity in spending on public education, the future of urban finance mortgaged to casino gambling, and the inability to prevent or respond effectively to the devastation of Hurricane Katrina in 2005 or the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008. The widely heralded comeback of American cities is thin and fragile. Look at city budgets and it does not seem nearly so robust. What is an American city has begun to elicit both a cacophony of definitions and an array of intelligent and promising ideas about how to respond. But these have not coalesced into a new urban progressivism. Without the will to forge an effective and coordinated political response, the future of American cities, however they are defined, is unlikely to be as buoyant as their past. In 2005, the year Barack Obama took his place in the United States Senate, the street mechanic Shorty, born 3 years after Obama, high on cocaine and alcohol, died from a knife wound on the racially segregated streets of North Philadelphia. Shorty's foreshortened life, a rundown row house on a mean street, frequent encounters with the police, work outside the regular economy, violent death at the hand of another black man, screamed the stubborn salience of race in American life. Whose life? Obama's or Shorty's? More accurately represented the trajectory of African American experience in early 21st century America. The question matters, not only because it cuts so close to the heart of 20th and 21st century American history, but also because it bears on important public policy choices in the present. Chapter 2 of the book, which addresses the question, suggests that the history of black economic inequality and mobility does not support either the optimistic or pessimistic version of African American history. But it does not come down in an illusory middle either. Rather, it recasts the issue by showing that after World War II, the nature of black inequality altered fundamentally. Inequality worked differently at the end of the 20th century than at its start or midpoint. Looking back at the last half-century, have the life prospects of African Americans worsened, improved, or remained about the same? Powerful arguments have been advanced in favor of each position. The book contends that this is the wrong question. The book asks instead, in what ways have African American social structure changed? The chapter points to two major trends. The first is to class differentiation, the division of African American social structure through the accumulation of many small and not so small distinctions. The distance between Barack Obama and the men fighting to the death in North Philadelphia illustrates the outcome. The other trend is the emergence of a gender gap. On most measures of education, income, and occupation, black women increasingly outpace black men. The historic pattern of black inequality based on social, economic, and political exclusion largely shattered during the course of the 20th century, replaced by 2000 with its features rearranged in new configurations of inequality. In the early 20th century, the sources and results of America's black-white divide overlapped with and reinforced one another. What stands out about the new pattern of inequality is the cumulative process from which it results, and the internal differentiation which is its product. Inequality among African Americans no longer grows out of a massive and mutually reinforcing legal and extra-legal, public and private system of racial oppression. Rather, it's a subtler matter. Thanks, Jordan. It's a subtler matter, proceeding through a series of screens that filter African Americans into more or less promising statuses, progressively dividing them along lines full of implications for their economic futures. Throughout the 20th century, despite repeated contractions and expansions in the degree of economic inequality, the income and wealth pyramid remained durable and steep, with continuities in the distribution of rewards by work, ethnicity, and gender. Yet immense individual and group mobility accompany this structural durability. The coexistence of structural rigidity with individual and group fluidity is the paradox of inequality. It is resolved by the process of internal group differentiation or splintering, as individuals divide along lines of occupation and income. Differentiation is one of the principal mechanisms through which inequality has been and continues to be reproduced in modern American society. The history of black economic inequality is also very much a story about gender, although gender has not received nearly as much systematic analysis as it deserves. Historians, by and large, have written about either black men or black women, paying only incidental attention to their comparative experiences over time. Inequality, however, has proceeded differently for African American women and men. In the middle of the 20th century, African American women fared much worse than African American men or white women. By the century's close, they had vaulted ahead of men in educational and occupational achievement, and they closed the gaps between themselves and white women more successfully than African American men reduced their distance from white men. This story of African American equality, thus, is not only about the relation between blacks and whites, it also traces the emergence of the gender gap between black men and black women. Public and quasi-public, that is, privately owned but government-funded employment, also has played a crucial role in the history of African American inequality and mobility. Especially for women, public employment has been the principal source of black mobility and one of the most important mechanisms for reducing black poverty. Its erosion in recent decades is one of the primary forces undermining black progress. Thus, the new black inequality that emerged in the last decades of the 20th century resulted from powerful technological, demographic, economic, and political forces. It was facilitated by massive social movements and abetted and shaped in every way by the state. And it left African Americans divided among themselves. Large numbers were peculiarly vulnerable to political retrenchment and economic reversal because they were employed in public or publicly funded jobs. A disproportionately high fraction lived in poverty, and many others enjoyed the benefits of upward mobility. While race remained a live force in American life, it worked in some new ways, sifting African Americans through a series of screens, residential, penal, occupational, educational, economic, that advantaged some and left others progressively behind. Familiar forms of inequality remained, and an alarming gender gap had opened between black women and black men. Large differences in labor force participation and earnings separated black and white men, and a much higher fraction of whites owned property and other assets. Nonetheless, inequality had been transformed. Earlier, the embodiment of ubiquitous converging forces of oppression. Late 20th century black inequality was the product of a sequence of differentiating experiences. Barack Obama and Shorty were two of its products. The new inequality was harder to pinpoint or characterize. more diverse, easier for an outsider to miss, but no less real. Now the stories of urban transformation and of the new African American inequality underlie the answer posed to the question of the book's title, What an American Cities Burn. The answer combines three general factors: a new ecology of power, the management of marginalization, and the incorporation and control of immigrants. Consider first the new ecology of power. The civil violence of the 1960s erupted when huge numbers of African Americans had moved into American cities and whites had not yet moved out. In the years following this great migration, whites decamped from central cities for suburbs, and many cities became majority or near majority minority. By 2000, only 21% of white Americans remained in central cities. This changed the ecology of power because when they left, whites ceded effective political control of cities to African Americans, retaining only a hold on commerce and finance and gentrified pockets of downtown. Ironically, African Americans inherited city governments at the moment when deindustrialization, cuts in federal aid, and white flight were decimating tax bases and job opportunities while fueling homelessness, street crime, and poverty. Nonetheless, with many whites gone, neighborhood boundaries became less contentious, eroding one source of civil violence. In the 1980s, massive immigration from Latin America and Asia reignited urban boundary conflicts, particularly in gateway cities where immigrants entered, triggering violence in South Central Los Angeles in 1992, the first major civil violence since the 1960s or early 1970s. But events in Los Angeles did not ignite fuses in other American cities. One reason lies in a set of mechanisms that deflected civil violence by managing marginalization. 5 of these mechanisms have proved crucial: selective incorporation, ostensible or mimetic reform, indirect rule, consumption, and repression and surveillance. Together they initiated a process of depoliticization that undercut the capacity for collective action. In the book I explain each of these in detail. Here I'll just go over them briefly. Selective incorporation refers to the gateways to better education, jobs, income, and housing that have opened to a significant fraction of African Americans and other minorities. The limited mobility that resulted has fractured African American communities along lines of class and gender. Women, as we've seen, are doing far better than men, and eroded the potential for collective protest by holding out the promise of economic and occupational achievement, as well as a modest prosperity. By mimetic reform, I mean measures that respond to insurgent demands without transforming real power or redistributing significant resources. Such reform cools out insurgencies. It does not resolve the problems that underlie them. White abandonment, selective incorporation, and mimetic reform resulted in indirect rule. Like colonial British imperialists who kept order through the exercise of authority by indigenous leaders, powerful white Americans retained authority over cities through their influence on minorities elected to political office, appointed to public and social service bureaucracies, and hired in larger numbers by police forces. Despite African American occupation of public offices, real power lay elsewhere. But indirect rule meant that civil violence, claims on city government, increasingly would be directed toward African American elected officials, public bureaucrats, and police. African Americans joined what historian Elizabeth Cohen has called America's Consumer Republic, an economy, culture, and politics built around the promises of mass consumption, both in terms of the material life and the more idealistic goals of freedom, democracy, and equality. This is definition. More African Americans than ever before were able to purchase the material symbols of the good life. In this way, the Consumers' Republic undermined black protest by shifting the focus of black demands to public accommodation and market access, thereby linking African American goals to mainstream American aspirations and subordinating alternatives based on black nationalism or social democratic visions of economic justice. At the same time, public authorities deployed or heightened techniques of repression and control. New federal grants provided police with money to purchase hardware, such as anti-riot tools, helicopters, and vehicles. In the same years, harsh policies of incarceration swept black men off city streets and into prison. America's prison population mushroomed. Its rate of incarceration led the world. In Los Angeles, contends urbanist Mike Davis, police repression of black power undermined a promising gang truce, while the decimation of the Black Panthers resulted in a revival of black gangs now permeated by a culture of violence and domination. In the 1990s, public authorities again dismissed gang truces and summits as hoaxes. As black men experienced disillusionment, depoliticization, and renewed criminal violence, many could not participate in politics even if they wanted to, because they were felons. Except for Maine, all states prohibited felons from voting, and many states continued to prohibit them after they left, from voting after they left prison. About 13% of African American men remain effectively disenfranchised, a percentage that could rise to 40% in states that permanently bar ex-offenders from voting. In the 1960s, African Americans lacked channels through which to make effective claims on the state. Other than through collective action, whether sit-ins or violence, they had few ways to force their grievances onto public attention or to persuade public authorities to respond. This changed as the new Ecology of Power opened new channels of access. People who once might have led protests now held positions from which they could argue that civil violence was both unproductive and even counterproductive. Others remained in America's inner cities, struggling to get by, disenfranchised, wary of the state, disillusioned with politicians, lacking leadership or a vision strong enough to mobilize them once more to make claims on the state. The recent history of African Americans in urban America is only partially helpful in contrasting American and European experience. For the civil violence that rocked France in 2005 and frightens other Europeans is a product of recent immigration, not of the grievances and frustrations of historically marginalized citizens. Both European and American cities have experienced recent massive immigration. Both have had to cope with infusions of low-skilled workers from different cultural traditions. But their parallels cease as immigrant incorporation and control take different routes, which have implications for the turn towards civil violence. In April and May 2005, immigrants across the United States, outraged by proposed federal legislation that would turn illegal immigrants into felons and criminalize efforts to assist them, took to the streets in protests that were coordinated, massive, and completely peaceful. On May 1st, more than 1 million marched in protest rallies in cities across the United States. Most of the 400,000 marchers in Los Angeles carried American flags. U.S. immigrants sought redress through government. Their protests assumed that they could realize their goals through the nation's political institutions. They approached government as a potential ally, not an enemy, wanting nothing so much as the rights of American citizens. In Paris, immigrants showed no such faith in the state. In the United States, with policing decentralized, insurgents tried to enlist the federal government as an agent of police reform. In France, conversely, where policing remained highly centralized, antagonism toward the police reinforced distrust of the national government. At the same time, in France, the state pursued a relentless policy of nationalization, rejecting even benign symbols of culture, such as wearing headscarves in school, a prohibition unthinkable in the United States. In their rage, frustration, alienation, and lack of confidence in or access to official political channels, protesters in France resembled African Americans in the 1960s more than immigrants to the United States in the late 20th century. Naturalization laws both reflected and reinforced divergent paths to immigrant incorporation. In France, naturalization rates are much lower. After 15 to 20 years of residence, naturalization rates are 20 percentage points lower in France than in the United States. In the United States, vocal hostility, allegedly, though the matter is not quite so straightforward, is directed not to all immigrants but to those who are undocumented. For them, the road to economic and civic incorporation is difficult, if not impossible, to reach. Public anger at undocumented immigrants, long simmering, exploded with stunning velocity, demanding still more border militarization and punitive policies towards immigrants themselves or those who employ, house, or assist them. The result, of course, undercut potential immigrant protests. Threats of deportation, which under the Obama administration increased to about 400,000 per year, and unemployment constitute an effective mechanism of social control, one that dampens the potential for both civil violence and peaceful protest. Poverty is the subject of the fourth and final substantive chapter of the book. Have changes in ideas about poverty and strategies for its alleviation accompanied the transformation of American cities? In fact, there has been a remarkable shift, which I refer to as the transition from underclass to entrepreneur. In the 1980s, underclass was the term applied most often to inner-city minority populations, a term which referred more to behavior than to economic condition. Underclass provided the latest iteration of the oldest trope about poor people, their division into the deserving and undeserving poor. By the first decade of the 21st century, underclass had become yesterday's idea. Instead, from Bangladesh to New York, writers celebrated the entrepreneurial energy of poor people waiting for the spark of opportunity to transform their lives. Poverty entrepreneurs jettisoned the underclass idea and developed new techniques of poverty work based on market-based principles. Beginning in the 1980s, market-oriented models reshaped public policy in housing, healthcare, education, welfare, and elsewhere. They also reconfigured ideas about poor people and anti-poverty policy. No longer an underclass, poor people became entrepreneurs. In the new market-based approach to poverty policy, initiative passed from a reduced state to the private sector, which offered innovations at once less demeaning and more effective, as well as less expensive. Advocates of market-based anti-poverty policies rejected pathological descriptions of poor people. Instead, in the writing of market-based theorists, poor people emerged as rational actors, consumers, savers, entrepreneurs. Four overlapping but distinct strategies dominated these new technologies of poverty work. Place-based approaches intended to rebuild markets in inner cities. Microfinance programs to transform people into entrepreneurs. Asset-building strategies designed to give poor people the means to accumulate capital, and conditional cash transfers that deployed monetary incentives to encourage poor people to change their behavior. Zones of concentrated poverty at the core of older American cities drifted outside legitimate markets. Prices plummeted so low, supply so outstripped demand, that no housing market remained. Supermarkets, banks, as well as manufacturing and other institutions of commerce had fled. In this situation, urban planners reasonably concluded that inner city revitalization required the recreation of markets. Two widely heralded policies, Ronald Reagan's enterprise zones and Bill Clinton's empowerment zones, proved disappointments, falling short of expectations. Enterprise and empowerment zones started with a deficit model. They intended to supply poor inner city neighborhoods with missing assets. By contrast, in his famous 1995 Harvard Business Review article, The Competitive Advantage of the Inner City, Harvard Business School professor Michael Porter took a radically different tack, portraying inner cities as full of untapped strengths, that capitalism, free of the clumsy and bureaucratic interference of governments, could tap to revitalize cities and reduce poverty. Porter influenced both the federal Small Business Administration and Bill Clinton's New Market Initiative, which attempted to mobilize tax incentives and private capital to revitalize poor urban and rural areas. On its website, the Initiative for a Competitive Inner City, Porter's national nonprofit, highlights successes in mobilizing money with which to support the creation of small businesses and tens of thousands of jobs. Impressive as these numbers are, nowhere on its website does the ICIC assess the bottom line, poverty and employment rates in inner cities and joblessness among African American men. Will its efforts provide isolated instances of success, or will they be transformative? The jury's out on this one. Of the four market-based strategies, only the first, rebuilding markets in inner cities, concentrated on regenerating places. The other three focused on individuals. Microfinance, the most famous of these, started in Bangladesh and spread with breathtaking speed around the world to developed as well as developing countries. Microfinance began in January 1977, when Muhammad Yunus, an economics professor in Bangladesh, started to lend money to poor women in small amounts, money for them to start their own businesses. In 1993, he founded the Grameen Bank. Grameen means village. The Grameen program offered poor women unable to tap the formal banking system an alternative to the formal economy of loan sharks and moneylenders who exploited them. Yunus lent money to women rather than men because he believed women were more likely to use it for the well-being of their families and because he hoped it would empower them. Borrowers repaid their loans in 1 year at an interest rate of 20%. Yunus claimed a repayment rate of 98%. Conventional poverty programs, which assumed poor people lacked the skills with which to find and hold paid work, began with training programs. Yunus turned this idea on its head by starting with cash. What the poor lacked, he believed, was access to credit, a fundamental right. Inspired by Grameen, a great many organizations around the world developed microcredit programs. The number of organizations affiliated with Grameen exploded. In 2008, throughout the world, 112 million people participated in microcredit programs. In 2006, Muhammad Yunus received the Nobel Peace Prize. Grameen reached even the United States, the first anti-poverty program to spread from an East Asian country to the developed West, which is pretty fascinating, with Grameen America opening its first branch in New York City in Queens in January 2008. The second opened in Omaha, Nebraska in 2009. Experienced managers were imported from Bangladesh to run them. Even the U.S. federal government adopted microfinance programs. With its own national organization, the Association for Enterprise Opportunity, microlending, in fact, became an industry. Eventually, sharp philosophical differences divided microlenders into two camps. To Yunus, the purpose of microlending was poverty alleviation. To the consultative group to assist the poor, CGAP, sponsored by the World Bank, the first priority was economic development. In practice, this resulted in the entrance of for-profit firms into microlending. Appalled at this transformation of microfinance, Yunus told listeners at the United Nations, quote, We didn't create microcredit to encourage loan sharks. Microcredit should be seen as an opportunity to help people get out of poverty in a business way, but not as an opportunity to make money out of poor people. Microfinance has not lacked for critics, and in recent years scandals have rocked programs. In the end, the bottom line about the results of microfinance remain unclear. Defining a metric of success, designing research programs, agreeing on a methodology for evaluation, all these remain elusive. What is clear is that Muhammad Yunus and Grameen have replaced pathological stereotypes of the poor with images of competent entrepreneurs. In the history of poverty policy, this is a signal achievement. In its second phase, Yunus and other leaders of the microfinance movement began to recognize the importance of financial services to poor people and the importance of savings. Reframed as asset building, savings became the core of an asset building movement that started in the United States, stimulated notably by Michael Sheridan's 1991 book, Assets and the Poor. Asset building quickly became an anti-poverty strategy of choice throughout the world of social policy. A 2010 report by the New America Foundation, one of the principal advocates of asset building to social policy, explained, quote, "Asset building refers to public policy and private sector efforts to enable individuals to accumulate and preserve long-term productive assets, savings, investments, a home, post-secondary education and training, a small business, and a nest egg for retirement." Like Yunus, the asset-based movement rejects pathological, moral, or culturally based theories of poverty. In the United States, the federal, state, and local governments have promoted the importance of individual assets. Through the tax code, for example, the federal government has supported home ownership and retirement savings. Almost all federal asset-based policy, however, goes to steadily employed homeowners, not the poor. According to one authoritative analysis in 2005, less than 3% of tax-based subsidies went to the 3/5 of families with the lowest incomes. The situation is especially bleak among African Americans. The gap separating black from white wealth is much greater than the income gap. Between 1984 and 2009, report Thomas Shapiro and colleagues, the gap between black and white assets skyrocketed from $84,000 to $236,500. At $265,000, median white household assets dwarfed the $28,500 figure among blacks. To direct asset building toward helping poor people leave poverty, Michael Sheridan proposed individual development accounts, IDAs. These are subsidized savings accounts targeted at poor people through matching grants rather than tax breaks. Sheridan sees IDAs as the vanguard of a revolution that will shift the emphasis of social policy from income support to asset accumulation. In fact, hundreds of IDA programs are spread across the country. Most states have some sort of IDA enabling policy, while federal legislation provided a legal structure and a funding mechanism for IDAs. Many community-based organizations implemented IDAs in the 1990s, most often with foundation funds. Major sponsorships come from the Ford Foundation, the New America Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and several others. The Assets at 21 conference, which I attended, sponsored by the New America Foundation in May 2012, clearly illustrated how asset building has become a national social movement. Two major research projects, the American Dream Demonstration, ADD, and Savings for Education, Entrepreneur, and Down Payment, SEED, have tested asset building as policy. The results, although pointing to useful directions for future policy, fell far short of unequivocal evidence of success. Research on IDA programs raises many questions, as the researchers themselves admit. Some are practical, others are more philosophical. Indeed, the reorientation of the welfare state around asset building would hasten its redesign around market principles. Still, it's undeniable the lack of assets traps people in poverty, and that many promising asset-building programs are underway throughout the U.S. In New York City, Mayor Michael Bloomberg launched an ambitious anti-poverty program that also rejected pathological images of the poor. The program included conditional cash transfers, CCTs, the fourth new strategy of anti-poverty work, which Bloomberg imported from Mexico. CCTs did not constitute the most important part of his anti-poverty agenda, but they became the most controversial. After 18 months, they provided the most visible failure. Conditional cash transfer programs transfer cash to poor households on the condition that they make specific investments in the human capital of their children. For instance, periodic medical checkups, growth monitoring, vaccinations, prenatal care for mothers, mothers' attendance at periodic health information tasks, school-related behavior, enrollment, regular attendance, and sometimes academic achievement. Most CCT programs transfer money directly to mothers, or in some instances to students. Details of CCT programs vary. There are huge programs in Brazil and Mexico, but all of them, a World Bank specialist points out, provide poor families with cash, quote, on the condition that they make investments in human capital, such as sending children to school or bringing them to health centers on a regular basis. CCTs represent, quote, a new generation of social programs that rely on market principles. Bloomberg, who traveled with his staff to Mexico to observe its Oportunidades program, formed a public-private partnership, Opportunity NYC, to implement the first full CCT program in the US. A cross-section of the elite of American philanthropy put up $50 million to fund a 3-year trial. After 18 months, a mid-course evaluation by the firm MDRC, hired to design and evaluate the program, turned in a mixed report, and Bloomberg announced the abrupt termination of the program, although not the evaluation. Neither the political left nor right liked Opportunity NYC. To the right, it rewarded the undeserving poor. Why reward parents who had failed to send their children to school regularly or take them for medical checkups? The left found CCTs paternalistic and offensive. Lacking a solid constituency, Bloomberg could not scale up CCTs with city funds. Perhaps it was less embarrassing to pull the plug than to lose a bruising fight with city council. The other components of Bloomberg's anti-poverty program appeared more promising, although recent data show that the poverty rate in New York City has increased. In fact, Bloomberg deserves great credit for mounting a major anti-poverty effort with poverty off the national political agenda. No other mayor within living memory had tried anything remotely similar. Bloomberg created the perfect anti-poverty program for a 21st century American city because it did not rely on federal initiatives or funding, combined public and private resources, reflected market-based principles, and was resolutely pragmatic and non-ideological. It also fit the 21st century because it focused on the deserving or working poor, eschewed redistribution, and paid no attention to the dependent poor. In this, Bloomberg's anti-poverty initiative tracked national policy, which since the 1990s has developed an array of programs to help the working poor while neglecting the non-working poor whose situation has stagnated or deteriorated. Market-based technologies of poverty do not assault the rigidities of social structure or the citadels of power. They elide the political economy of power. They propose to solve poverty on the cheap, with relatively little public money, and without growing the size of government very much. They reduce the role of government to impresario, organizing, partially funding, and coordinating a new show, rather than creating and managing new programs. That said, they have the potential to improve the lives of a great many people, while smoothing the rough edges of capitalism. Is this the best for which we can hope? In the book's epilogue, I raise a question which grows out of both the earlier chapters and out of my work as a teacher of urban studies. Both the political left and right tell a similar disheartening story about the history of American cities after World War II. The facts are largely accurate and beyond dispute. Many of them are in the book. But are they the whole story? As it stands, the narrative of urban history is depressing, and it leaves students unsatisfied. Is it possible, they wonder, to make a difference? The question leads me to believe that we need a new urban narrative, one that is still true to the facts, but wider in its frame and more inclusive. I see bits and pieces that can be used to construct it, but building the new frame remains an unfinished task. It is, I suggest, the underlying task of progressive politics as well as of urban history. One of the central tasks of the new narrative is to rehabilitate the role of government. At one level, it's not a very difficult job. A close look at any realm of public life, from poverty reduction to health, will identify many examples of constructive action that are not only taken by government, but that are impossible for any institution other than government. I don't have to argue this in Canada. Take health, for instance. Through Medicare, government vastly increased the availability of quality medical care to the elderly, who by and large have taken full advantage of the program. It's hard, if not impossible, to imagine any agent other than the federal government quickly and efficiently bringing health care to the elderly. Indirectly, government funding of research and medical training has resulted in revolutionary new medications and therapies. Government, not cowboy pioneers in Silicon Valley working out of their garages, provided the incentives and funding for digital computing and the internet. At another level, the problem is more difficult. Government initiatives did not always succeed or work as intended. The prevailing master narrative is a litany of such failures. The issue is not assessing praise and blame, arriving at some kind of government report card. Rather, the challenge is figuring out why some initiatives work better than others and why in other cases perverse, unintended outcomes outweigh benefits. Meeting the challenge is important for at least three reasons: countering the myth of government ineptitude, undermining the disabling myth of inevitability, and balancing the focus on structure with an appreciation of agency. Thus, I want readers to take away at least four things from this book. First, an understanding of urban transformation and its consequences. To comprehend the world in which we live, we need to toss out older ideas of city, suburb, and urban. The exercise is not just intellectual, it's necessary if we're to develop politics and policies which respond to the situation as it is, not as it was not so very long ago. Second is an ability to criticize statements that attribute poverty to the failings of individuals. By this point in history, it should be clear that the attribution of poverty to personal defect, along with the hoary idea of the undeserving poor, is intellectually bankrupt and incapable of pointing the way to effective strategies for substantially reducing the unacceptable extent of poverty. Third, an appreciation of the positive role of government and a healthy skepticism about the ability of privatization and policies based on market models to solve major social problems. The denigration of government is one of the most corrosive public trends in recent American history. Its ugly consequences are all around us. Without strong, effective governments, a vibrant, successful democracy is impossible. Fourth, a willingness to reject the idea that there is no alternative. TINA, the acronym, as the late Daniel Singer called the idea, is a powerful ideological control mechanism for disabling protest and creative thinking about possibilities for change and alternative policies. Alternatives have always existed, as they do today. The question is whether we have the imagination and the will to make them happen. This, I suggest, is the important and encouraging message of Occupy Wall Street. Had the Occupy movement happened a little earlier, or had I written the book a little later, it might have made a perfect ending. Why Don't American Cities Burn ends with a quotation from the brilliant urbanist Ananya Roy, and I will read this quotation, and I love it. In teaching my course, Global Poverty, at Berkeley, I am struck by a contrast. On the one hand, I have students who are brimming with enthusiasm to do good. They want to save the world. They believe they can. On the other hand, I have students who are cynical, those who are able to level sharp critiques of structures of injustice, but not believe that change is possible. I teach in the impossible space between the hubris of benevolence and the paralysis of cynicism. Finding this impossible space is what this book calls the existential dilemma of urban studies, and in the larger sense, it is the quest to which it is devoted. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We have about 15, a little more than 15, almost 20 minutes for some questions. Do you want to take a breath and then start us off?
Sure.
Yep.
Any comments from the last 2 days regarding the election? Your hopes, your dreams, your anything related?
Why am I not surprised at this question? Well, I'm very pleased. I'm very, very pleased. Unlike almost all my friends, I'm not surprised. I have been cautiously optimistic throughout the whole process. I'm pleased, not only because of Obama's victory and also because it was substantial, but also by the results in the Senate. And was thrilled by Elizabeth Warren's election in Massachusetts. So I don't know. I'm hoping that since he doesn't have to run for re-election again, since the worst crisis in the economy seems to have abated, I'm hoping Obama will be able to be more aggressive than he was in his first term, and go on in the second term with even the first term we had really great achievements. Do it for a historian of the welfare state. This was just a monumental 4 years. So I'm hoping for more, and not totally pessimistic about it happening. Yes?
You mentioned that Black women economically outpace Black men in the latter half of the 20th century. How do they economically relate to white women at the same time?
Well, here's something really interesting. If you hold education constant, they earn the same amount of money. On the whole, they earn less because fewer of them have advanced degrees and so on. But if you look at women college graduates, for instance, black and white, the earnings are about the same. It's not the case with men. Yes.
What are the theories in terms of why there is this gender gap?
Well, it's a really good question.
Can you repeat the question, please?
The question is why this gender gap exists. Partly, I think, partly there's this tremendous hostility towards black men, the sense of them as threatening, the difficulties that they have finding work, all kinds of surveys and so on show that in fact employers are reluctant to hire them, that black women have the kind of soft skills that employers will want in much greater greater numbers. I'm sure there are other kinds of, also factors as well. Also, women have the fields through which black women have achieved their success have been gendered fields in social services, in education. That's where opportunities have been open. There's historically opened, more to women than to men in those fields. But those are parts of the explanation, but I'm sure there's a lot more
Is there anything,
deeper to it as well.
any theories around like absent fathers? Does that trend tends to affect men more than like women?
Well, I'm always reluctant to go into social psychological theories because they've been used, to stigmatize people and so on, and it's really hard to prove them. So, I'm sure some people have that theory, but I don't go there myself. Yes?
Couple of thoughts. I'm still not sure that that I see why there isn't more rage against the system directed externally. Why American cities don't burn. And part of what's going through my mind, and I'm not sure if they're connected at all or not, but the work of Robert Putnam around bowling alone and things like that, about the loss of social structure and social cohesion that he's observed. I'm wondering if there's a connection there as much as there isn't, as perhaps there was. I was thinking about 1848, about the great revolutionary movements and so on. And there doesn't seem to be the structure there to harness that rage that should be there and direct it outwards. And I'm just wondering what you think is behind all of that, or whether anything you've talked about there is factoring into that.
Clearly there does not seem to be the kind of civic political organizations to harness anger and frustration in constructive directions politically. That seems to be certainly the case. I think a lot of the churches do a lot of social service work, and some, I guess, are more quiescent politically. And the organizational structure in many cases for guys is gangs, which what's this all about? Here, oh yes. Which move in quite a different direction. So building that sort of civic infrastructure is necessary and really difficult to achieve in a circumstance when people, when guys don't have work, when they're out of the regular labor market, when they're in the informal economy, and when they're so likely to end up in prison. Can't underestimate the impact of prison in all of this. Sir?
I keep going back to, well, part of what I read in this has a lot, it seems to me, to do with development theory. And one of the things that sparked that for me was later in the book about their leaders developed theories of dependence and internal colonialism, and that immediately goes back to me with what was happening in the 60s and how politicized all of those events were. And there was no real social infrastructure that was in place at that time, it seems to me. It grew from the ground up, didn't it? Mm-hmm. So the fact is that social infrastructure has essentially disappeared in some sense. but it wasn't there before, and yet something happened. And the cities did burn.
That's true. That's true. They did. And I think it's the constellation of factors that I tried to lay out here that accounts for the difference. It's not one thing. It's a combination. It's a combination of several. It's a combination of several things.
Mm-hmm.
So that the situation is now just so fundamentally different than it was in the '60s from the ecology of cities to the capacity of public authorities to respond, and to the degrees of surveillance and repression, to the consumer influence of consumption, consumer culture. All of these are. There's just this. It is such a contextually different climate. It makes it very, very hard for me to imagine that any large, sustained kind of collective violence would occur. Not that that would be a good thing, but I mean, the real question is, I mean, how one can harness the kind of anger, I think, that is probably out there on the streets into some effective political movement and political capacity. That wasn't, Mike Davis argues that was happening. That was beginning to happen in the '60s, and it was beginning to happen through the Black Panthers, and that the police broke it up.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very controversial thesis, but
But that's that whole area of repression was there then too.
It was, but it was not, I've been thinking about this, and what it seems to me in a rough sense is a difference between a reactive and a proactive strategy of policing and public and repression, if you want to use that term. That in fact, what was happened in the '60s caught public authorities more or less by surprise. So in fact, what they were doing was they were reacting. They had no very good plans thought out in advance and so on. And part of what's happened since then has been a much greater sophistication and attempt to develop means to head this kind of activity off.
Well, as you say, it's far more militarized than it was.
Sure, and there's far more intelligence gathered and all kinds of stuff.
I
Sir.
have a couple questions over here. I think I saw Jim first here, and then
One of the, in the post-Vietnam era, one of the organizations of American government that has undergone one of the greatest changes in terms of both race and gender is the American Armed Forces. And I might suggest it's not accidental that General Colin Powell preceded Barack Obama. I wonder if you have any comments on the impact of that change on the thesis you wrote.
Well, that's a great point. That's a really, really great point. I haven't thought of those linkages. I mean, you're, 100% right. I mean, the Army is probably the most successfully integrated institution in America, right? Yes, and Colin Powell did become a great national figure, great stature and popularity and so on. So, he may have been probably was a very important precursor of Obama. But the larger impact of that successful integration of the Army and how it feeds back into the non-military aspects of society, that's a great issue. I don't know the answer to it, or offhand how to really think about it. It would be a really great topic, great thesis topic. So there's graduate students here looking for a topic.
I think we have to do our last question.
To this point, it seems like everything you've said, and most of the questions seem to revolve around strictly internal issues within the United States. And I'm just thinking back to the 1960s, and I think then that the international issues had a significant impact, which probably did stimulate some kind of maybe more organized, but also more conscious, politically conscious action, some of which became random social violence, but some of which was organized as well. I'm thinking about things such as Malcolm X and,
yes.
and his kind of understanding of the world and people's inspiration by national liberation movements.
Yes,
well.
yes.
Wondering whether that has, perhaps the lack of that, or the change in the nature of those international influences may have led to what you're describing basically as what seems like a just random social violence internally within the black community, rather than eruptions against the power structures by the black man.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. You know, that's a great point too, because clearly many people saw the movements in the 60s as part of larger national liberation movements, and that really isn't available in the same way today. Yeah. Excellent. And there's somebody back there who really wants to ask a question.
Thanks. Alan Strecker suggesting McCarthyism is the reason why injustice is so deeply entrenched in the United States. The effects of McCarthyism, when organizers were purged systematically, many imprisoned, but fundamentally blacklisted from their jobs. So the loss of the organizing knowledge within working class structure is why so many injustices is systematically prevail over the last 60 years.
Well, that's a very good point as well. Because that clearly happened. I mean, it clearly happened. McCarthyism was a huge, powerful, malignant force with power, long consequences. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Okay.
Can I just?
Yeah.
Just one thing what I've just been thinking about in the last few weeks. My current project is I'm doing a very new version of my older book, The Undeserving Poor, which is going to be really a new book. And one of the things, this is just to alert you to look out for, that has really just struck me, is the rapid growth of biological explanations for the biological consequences of poverty and inequality. There's a huge literature of this around us that's growing out of neuroscience, and particularly out of epigenetics. And the idea that it's a kind of revived Lamarckianism, the idea that environmental influences that poor children experience when they're very young can cause or bring about expressions of genes that inhibit their capacity to learn and develop and so on properly, and that some would argue that those in turn get passed on genetically to their offspring. So there's this whole new literature. It's coming on like a tsunami, and you're going to hear much more about it. And I'm just going around talking about it when I can. I mean, I don't know very, I'm not a biologist. I don't know very much about it. I'm trying to read about it, but it's all has the potential in the wrong hands to be very alarming.
Please join me in thanking